Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about why as human beings we do research. Research itself is a process. Why do we do research as a human being? These are the things that I'm going to cover. I'm going to try and explain aspects related to the human condition, why humans need to have a process of research, and I'm going to try and bias this towards the native African experience, so that those who feel the need to do research on the African continent, particularly in Southern Africa, can have a better understanding of how to go about things and how people generally see things in the Southern African part of Africa. So, what do I mean by the human condition? The human condition is such that the human being finds it very difficult to live in a complex world without explaining it. Now, can you imagine the first Homo sapiens who were on the planet seeing lightning and thunder and so on? The human mind is such that it needs explanations for these things. And the failure to find explanations for these things would drive it mad. So it became very, very important for human beings to come up with answers to these challenges or other conditions that they found in the environment in which they lived. The failure to come up with such an answer was going to result in the human spending the whole day thinking and trying to understand the environment and doing little of what was the important stuff, like looking for food and trying to survive. So it became very important to have an imagination. Have an imagination, and for those answers that were difficult to come by through experience. For instance, if the human being was able to realize that if I am cut by a stone, I bleed, then the question, what does a stone do when you step on it, was going to be easily answered through the words, I bleed, because there's experience. But there were those questions which could not be answered through experience. For instance, where does lightning come from? Why are we here? Why do people get sick? Now, in the absence of experience and in the absence of the knowledge or experience of others, such a question would trouble the human mind so much. So without imagination, this trouble will continue. But it became important for people to imagine answers, to imagine these answers, and they allowed them to continue living their life because to them, the imagined answers were very true. Now, in the African context, questions that were always troubling were questions related to where do we come from as people? Where do we die and go to? Why are we born? So a lot of elaborate myths came up to try and explain these ideas. A lot of elaborate myths probably came up, starting with individuals and societies and so on. But whatever the case may be, to those people and those societies who believed these myths, they were true. So Yuval Harari, in his book Sapiens, explains this idea of collective imagination, where people imagine things together. And because they imagine things together, they are true. Now, in the snippet that I put on this lesson, I speak about a story, an imaginative story of the first Homo sapien, for instance, who I've called Tamu. Tamu is raised by apes and does not get a chance to speak to humans, any other humans or any other Homo sapiens around him. He does not develop language, but he's able to speak to himself because of a highly developed brain. As he speaks to himself, he gives himself answers to these questions that I'm asking. Where does lightning come from? Why do we have food? So that he does not keep asking and continuously, incessantly trying to find out what is happening, Tamu gives himself answers to these questions. Lightning comes from a big fish in the sky, because this is what he knows. Now, it doesn't matter how ridiculous this sounds, but the researcher should understand that to Tamu, this is true, and this is a fact to him. So the problem comes in when we start to live as a society. Tamu, for some reason, is rescued by other Homo sapiens. From these apes, they bring him to their village, and they ask him, where have you been? He says, no, I've been taken care of by the big fish in the sky, which gives me water. This is what he believes. And they laugh at him because this is not what they believe. Now, that is the problem which comes in, which I call the information sharing problem. The information sharing problem is a problem that arises when we now have to ask the question, who is telling the truth? You see? Who is telling the truth? That is the fundamental problem which we start off with as researchers. In order to understand who is telling the truth, Deepak Chopra and in his book You Are the Universe comes up with ideas where we realize that this idea of telling the truth is based on the upcoming issues and studies of consciousness, where the argument is there is first party consciousness, second party consciousness, and third party consciousness. In first party consciousness, we are saying you are experiencing the world on your own, and you are feeling the subjective experiences. What do I mean by subjective experiences? This is where we attempt to differentiate the mind and the brain, where we say the brain is the apparatus that allows you to do intelligent things like calculate this and calculate that and know what components to put into this and that to create a particular item. But the mind is different from the brain. The mind are the subjective experiences that you as a human being go through. And these experiences are what create you. For instance, suppose in this snippet I gave you, I gave an example of honey. The brain can explain the components of honey from a molecular level, explain to you why honey looks the way it is, the composition of honey in terms of carbohydrates, sucrose and glucose and so on. But no matter how much the brain explains it, you need a Homo sapien who is alive to come and taste it. When you taste it, you feel joy, you feel happiness, you feel the sweetness. All those subjective experiences are what we actually call the mind. Now, this is what has been termed first-party consciousness. And the argument is, if we want to know who is telling the truth, the science that we have today generally does not accept first-party consciousness, because they argue that first-party consciousness is subjective. We are never sure if you are telling the truth. We are now subject to your own interpretation, which at times may be faulty, which at times may be unrealistic, which at times may be based on other things that do not have any relevance to everyone. So your reality, the argument, is warped in accordance to how you've been socialized. So we cannot trust you as someone who's telling the truth. Second party consciousness comes in when it is now you and someone else. But we argue that maybe both of you are delusional. So we cannot trust you. Hence, the majority of research that we've been doing and science that we've been pushing has been based on third-party consciousness, where we argue that if more than two people, and many people even better, see the same thing, therefore, it should be true. You see? Now, the challenge is, what you have to know is, every time when we're attempting to do research, we're attempting to tell the truth. Tell the best possible truth we can from a third-party consciousness perspective. But there is a challenge. We've already shown, based on first-party consciousness and second-party consciousness, that it's virtually impossible to tell the truth. What you end up giving us is an interpretation based on your subjective experiences, or the combination of two people's subjective experiences, or something that people have agreed to be true. This is where you have different perspectives in society. But where you get to the underlying fact is where you realize that it is impossible to really tell the truth, because it is always from a particular perspective. Not to say the truth is not there, but the minute you speak of it, you spoil it. Hence, we can argue that he who tells the truth has lied, because that person subjects us to their subjective experiences and attempts to parcel it as the truth. But the researcher is different. The researcher will experience it subjectively, but attempt to use third-party consciousness to give you a better version of the truth. Hence, we tend to accept research that is based on that sort of consciousness. So research methods as we have it now is generally based on third-party consciousness. And we have to understand how third-party consciousness comes about as Africans. It is a result of Africans attempting to tell their own truth about the way they see things, their own truth about the way they attempt to live within the environment they find themselves in, their own truth about the way they relate with everything they find. Now, unfortunately, this third-party consciousness of most native Africans has been overtaken by third-party consciousness of other people, races, cultures, and so on. As a result, it has started to lag behind as almost a 2.5 consciousness, where we have failed to explain things the way we see them, and we tended to borrow a lot from other cultures. What does this mean? We end up not having authentic African research that is based on the ways in which we see things. So you end up having the African scholar who works as a scholar by day but lives as an African by night, or works as a scholar in the office but lives as an African every other time. Understanding the world in third-party consciousness from African terms. Do we have different consciousness? I think it is all the same. All third-party consciousness is third-party consciousness. But the power of the story that we tell ourselves is the one that is very important, because it is the power of the story that we tell ourselves that moves us closer to the truth. So the research student should always understand that every time when we do research, we are always attempting to get to the best possible truth, and particularly based on third-party consciousness. Now, in the next lesson that we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be explaining how these understandings of consciousness and the importance of a story have been used through history to mold the different ways of telling the truth or telling a story that is convincing and that is going to keep everyone together. Remember, we've already explained that the collective imagination, the third-party consciousness, is very, very important, because it is only through it that our society can function. Because if we are not able to imagine things together, like countries, laws, and so on, all these are imagined things, including time. We have to imagine it so that we can work together. So without that third-party consciousness, it becomes very difficult to argue that this is the truth and that is not the truth. So the first point of the researcher is to understand what we mean by the truth. And even more, for the African researcher, is to understand what it is that we mean by the truth from an African perspective.